120 registrants. The meeting will be recorded. And feel free to put your location, your name and location in the chat box. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Welcome, everyone. We still have quite a few hopping on here. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 1 minute. And feel free to put your location or name and CASA program in the chat box. We'll get started at 12:02 today. Well, welcome, and thank you all so much for joining our CASA network, or what we call our CASA family across Colorado. Welcome to our February monthly statewide Lunch and Learn, hosted by Colorado CASA. We have now been doing these for almost 2 years since COVID came stomping in on us spring of 2020. I'm Jenny Bender. I'm one of the team members here and the executive director of our state organization, Colorado CASA. We're an association of 18 local CASA programs throughout the state. And together, collectively, in 2021, over 2,300 CASA volunteers in Colorado fiercely advocated for over 4,500 children. So this is really a movement, and what you're doing is a part of just such huge collective impact. Despite the pandemic and all of our operational challenges over the past few years, collectively, we are continuing to steadily grow. And in the past 3 years, we have grown by 16% in number of volunteers. So this means now more than ever, children need a CASA volunteer. We will have ready and trained volunteers for those case assignments. And many of you on this call, on this webinar today are new. So thank you so much for being here. The familiar faces, the familiar names, and those who are new. Each month we've been conducting these relevant continuing education trainings for our network. And these will be recorded and posted on our website, which is coloradocasa.org. So stay tuned for a calendar of our future 2022 events. We're especially excited about today's topic. But before we welcome our speaker, I want to thank and introduce to some of you Kelsey Fife-Doherty. She's our data and evaluation manager at Colorado CASA, and she helped us organize this educational opportunity. Kelsey's new to Colorado CASA. She's replaced previously Lily Sussman. And she has fit in our team like a pro. Some of you have probably already heard from her. You'll see her around with an introduction in the monthly bulletin. You'll get to work with her for well-being assessments and just a variety of different committees she'll be leading for us. So welcome, Kelsey, and thank you. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I imagine we're going to have a lot of questions for today's topic, and we're super excited. So thank you, Tisa and Kelsey, for helping us field these questions. Please do not be shy. This is our time to ask questions of our experts. So today's topic is a training for CASA volunteers and staff to better support the diverse sex and gender expressions of youth and families served. Sex and gender diversity have always been a feature of human societies, but with the advent of the internet communications, these diverse populations have really grown dramatically. And in this presentation, Dr. Elizabeth Eli Sheff will explain sex and gender minorities, SGM, and define some of the most common SGM identities in both parents and youth. And then Eli will explore some of the issues facing SGM youth, parents, and families involved in our system, child welfare system. And finally, we'll explore some ways that CASA volunteers can really advocate for queer youth in the system and share resources for the youth and their caregivers. So we have an amazing expert here today, Dr. Elizabeth Eli Sheff. She, her is a researcher, expert witness, a coach, a speaker, an educational consultant with a PhD in sociology and a certification as a sexuality educator. Dr. Eli specializes in gender and sexual minority families, consensual non-monogamy, and kink BDSM. Sheff is the foremost academic expert on polygamous families with children. And her 25-year polygamous family study is the only longitudinal study right now with poly families that have children to date. So currently lecturing at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, and that's where I believe she's coming to us from, Dr. Eli has also, I'm looking at, I think you're in Tennessee right now. Eli has also taught at the University of Colorado, University of Montana, Georgia State University, and so many more. Sheff co-chairs the Consensual Non-Monogamous Legal Issues Team for the American Psychological Association. And Dr. Eli is also helping a series of books on diverse sexualities, genders, and relationships with Dr. Richard Sprout and the publishers of the Rowman and Littlefield. In collaboration with these colleagues, Dr. Eli developed the Bonding Project, a test people can take to explore their preferred bonding styles. That looks super interesting as well. So we'll have to check that out. In addition to more than 20 peer-reviewed journal articles and chapters Dr. Eli has written, she also has published 4 books and is working on more. So what a treat. We get to have you here today with our CASA family. Thank you so much. Please help me welcome Dr. Eli Sheff.
Thank you. I'm actually coming to you today from New Mexico.
Oh, nice.
I study polyamorous families, which are actually somewhat different from polygamous families, tend to have just one partner that has multiple partners. And in polyamorous families, all genders have multiple partners, not just men, which is generally under polygyny. That's how that works. So hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you. Carrie Rivera, I see that your hand is up. Did you have a specific question before we start? Or you're gone now? Okay. I'm just going to share my screen and jump into it. Oh, no, we want to go from the beginning, though. There we go. Gender and sexual diversity in foster children for CASAs. As my delightful introducer said, I am a sociologist. I also work as an expert witness for families of sex and gender minorities whose custody of their children is potentially threatened. I'm a researcher, educator, relationship coach, writer, publication consultant, and I was a CASA in Atlanta for the Fulton County Juvenile Court for probably 8 years, I think. And then over here are some books I've written. So LGBTQIAP, it's a really intimidating list of, it's an acronym that just keeps getting longer and longer and longer. And there's no single agreed upon set acronym. LGBTQ is often pretty standard, but what comes after that is pretty fluid, I would say. And today, we are not talking about an exhaustive list. For one thing, as soon as I would make what I would think is an exhaustive list, then a new identity would crop up, because sex and gender identities, especially among youth, are fluid and evolving. So not only are there too many, and they change frequently. So we're just going to kind of go over some of the most popular. And these identities, even in the same kind of sexual orientation, for instance, would vary tremendously depending on the person, especially by social privilege. People with a lot of social privilege are much more free to be unconventional or to have a diverse sex and gender presentation. Race and social class are the two primary elements of social privilege that engage there. Gender is also quite important, as well as age. And for some of you folks in the more rural areas of Colorado, locale is going to be very important. Let's just touch briefly on some sex and gender terminology. Gender is socially perceived and externally expressed. So if you look at someone and you think, oh, that person looks like a woman, or that person looks like a man, you're probably not examining their genitalia. You're probably looking at their social cues. For instance, my hairdo probably tells you, oh, that's probably a woman. Perhaps the way I use my hands when I speak, or my vocal intonation, the sound of my voice. Things also like the way people dress, the kind of adornments they use, how do they decorate themselves, jewelry, makeup, how they move and walk. Things like that can all contribute to gender. In contemporary US society, we often confuse gender and sex, but while they are related, they're separate as well. Gender identity is internally felt. So I identify as a cisgender woman because when I was born, the doctor looked at me and said, this little naked baby looks like a girl. This baby has girl parts. We're going to assign female at birth. And that gender assignment has never been problematic for me. I'm not exactly sure what a woman feels like, but whatever that is, I'm comfortable with that gender assignment. I've never felt like, oh, that doesn't quite fit for me. So cis, C-I-S, there on the screen, means on the same side. If you are assigned at birth a gender that feels right to you, then you stay there, you stay on the same side. If, however, you are assigned at birth a gender that doesn't match your internal experience, then you might be transgender, which means across. So transgender folks are people who don't identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. Sex is a genital thing. It's a physical thing. It's based on chromosomes, and it's usually perceived or constructed, what we call assigned, at birth. Generally, when people are born, the doctors are say, this is a male, this is a female. Sexual orientation is different from both sex and gender in that it's the direction of desire. Kind of what are we attracted to? What kinds of people, if any, do we find interesting as potential sexual partners? That's sexual orientation. So here is the gender unicorn. And this is from the Trans Student Educational Resources. And you can find this online. This website right here, transstudent.org, is a really useful website for all sorts of educational materials and posters. And I love the way they break this down. They've almost got it. They have nailed gender identity, which is how you think about yourself or feel inside. So you're probably female, male, girl, male, man, boy, or other genders, transgender, gender non-conforming, gender non-binary. Gender expression is what other people see you doing. And we kind of characterize that as either feminine, sometimes they call that femme, F-E-M-M-E, or masculine, and sometimes they'll abbreviate that to mask, M-A-S-C. Then there's the sex assigned at birth. And again, if you're cisgender, your sex assigned at birth, your gender expression, and your gender identity are all the same. For me, that's female across the board. For some people, those don't match. And we'll talk about intersexed a little bit later. If you've never heard that term, hold on and I'll explain it to you. So this physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to are two different components of sexual orientation. You can be physically attracted to women, men, trans folks, non-binary folks. You can also be emotionally attracted to all of those different people. Sometimes people are physically and emotionally attracted to the same people. Sometimes those are different. They find one kind of person physically appealing and a different kind of person emotionally appealing. The only thing I would say is missing from that discussion of physically and emotionally attraction is the option of no one. There is an increasing number of people who are recognizing their sexual orientation as asexual, meaning they don't have sexual attraction to other people. And that also breaks down into subcategories. And we'll get to that. It's one of the initials. Gender pronouns, we used to think that they were just obvious. If you saw someone who looked like a woman, that was a she. And again, in my case, that's accurate. I do use the she, her, hers pronouns. People who are feminine tend to use that. Masculine folks will often use he, him, his. And an increasing number of especially young people are using the gender non-binary pronouns of they, them, and theirs. Similarly, non-binary Z, here, or zir, and zirs, that has kind of fallen out of favor, and most people use they or them if they're trying to talk about non-binary, but Z is a little more popular in Europe. So now we're going to start on the big long string of initials. Does it start with LGBTQ or GLGBTQ? And what letter it starts with is actually important because order, what order we put things in, is one indicator of importance in the movement or the community. So initially, it was GLB, well, initially it was just gay, then it was gay and lesbian, then it was gay, lesbian, bisexual, and then it just exploded into many more additional letters. But we kind of rearranged it a little bit and replaced the G with the L at first to try to kind of underline that in this male-dominated culture, we've had historically the LGBTQ movement has been quite male-dominated, in part because men had more access to public space, more money to influence legislators, and more of a voice in the culture at large. Also, we have quite in the United States, quite the racist and white privileged culture, which means that also lesbian and gay culture has also historically been dominated by white people. Recent shifts towards diversity have been in the community at large have been slow to permeate to the top of the movement, meaning the infrastructure or the agenda of what people decide is important. So lesbians are women who are sexually attracted to other women. Gay can either be an umbrella term for anyone with same-sex desire, or can mean specifically gay men who are attracted to other men. B stands for bisexual. And bisexuals within the LGBTQ movement have often been marginalized, either as fence sitters, which was a very common slur, who are unwilling to relinquish heterosexual privilege and just want to kind of dabble in same-sex relationships, but then run back to other sex relationships when it's time to have anything serious happen. Also stigmatized as promiscuous carriers of disease, especially among lesbians, and as untrustworthy. There was at one point a small separate bisexual movement, which has been kind of subsumed once again into the larger LGBTQ movement and somewhat into just the Q of the queer movement. But ironically, bisexuals are more common, especially among women, than are purely gay or lesbian people. So even though they're really kind of stigmatized and looked down on in some elements of the LGBTQ movement, they're far more numerous than purely gay or lesbian folks. They overlap. The bisexuals are especially numerous among polyamorous and kinkster communities. We can talk about that later. They are not that relevant to foster youth generally. Other terms that are very similar to bisexuality that youth might use: ambisexuals, omnisexuals, pansexuals kind of won the race for young people of how to describe someone who is interested in both feminine and masculine folks. So pansexuality, especially for Generation Z and younger millennials, is a much more common identity than bisexuality. Even though it might mean the same thing, they often prefer the term pansexuality. And homosexuals, very few people use, but we'll talk about that one too. T for transgender. This one's very common, especially among youth. It's a sex gender category and not really a sexual identity, but we're talking about it today because they face very similar hurdles in life, and especially as youth. So they really belong in this category of disadvantaged youth who end up in foster care with high elements of social risk. So transgender folks can be any sexual orientation. Their sexual orientation may change when they transition, or it may not. So they might go, if they were bisexual already, they might just stay bisexual. If they were heterosexual and then remain attracted to the same kind of person, they might have become gay or lesbian. If they were gay or lesbian first and then remain attracted to the same kind of person, they might become heterosexual as their gender identity changes. So basically, gender identity and sexual orientation are separate categories. They vary independently. So it's because of the similar issues with discrimination and gender nonconformity that transgender folks are often lumped into a sexuality framework. One exception to this is the group of people who identify as transsexual, in that they're attracted to transgender people as sexual partners. Transsexual used to be a common term applied to transgender people who had had some kind of surgical alteration to more closely appear as the gender that they are comfortable with. Now that term has fallen out of favor in terms of applied to transgender people and is more applied almost exclusively to the people who are attracted to transgender people. There's a wide range of transgender identities, kind of a big spectrum. Transgender is the broadest identity. And you always, when you're talking about transgender people, you always label them as where they end up. So, and this MTM and FTM is slightly older terminology. Some folks still use it, but your folks, you're young enough people to be in foster care right now, Generation Z, will probably be using transgender, or just like if they were male to female, call them a woman or a girl. Trans woman is what people used to label that as. Female to male, call them a man or a trans man. Transsexual, again, is kind of out of favor. It's a medical label that implies surgery. Cross-dressers have replaced the term transvestite, and that applies to people who don't actually want to change their gender, but enjoy wearing clothes of a different gender. And that's hardly ever applied to feminine people, because in contemporary US society, women can wear most things. Women can wear jeans and a t-shirt. They can wear pants and it's no problem. So the box of women didn't used to be able 100 years ago, they couldn't wear pants, things like that. Like it was shocking if they wore a skirt short enough to see their ankles. Now, women can wear any color, any fabric, any pants, dress, skirt, whatever they want. Men, however, have a much smaller box. And generally, if they go out of this very tiny little box of what's acceptable to them, even by wearing a shirt that's a color that isn't blue, brown, black, gray, dark green, not a pastel green, not a vibrant green, dark green. You know, if men wear pink, they get that sense of others around react to them as if somehow they're outside of the bounds of acceptable masculinity. So cross-dressers contemporarily are almost always men. Generally, cisgender heterosexual men who like the feeling of wearing women's clothes. Women who like the feeling of wearing men's clothes are hardly ever labeled as cross-dressers because they're allowed. Women's underwear, women even have, I'm trying to remember what they're called, boy shorts Has anybody ever heard of that? Boy shorts underwear? They're a kind of underwear made specifically for women. Women wear boxer shorts and things like that. They'll even get boxer shorts with their sorority embroidered on the back, things like that. That's okay for women to wear. But there is no room right now for a man to wear girl panties and still be classified as a man. At that point, he's often classified as a cross-dresser. Drag kings and drag queens are people that more perform in a performance space, a gender that does not match their own. So drag kings are often women performing as men. Drag queens are often men performing as women. And like so many other things, that has begun to change as well, that now non-binary people also perform drag of either gender. So drag at all implies this kind of exaggerated gender performance that has lots of, if you're a drag queen, you're going to have big makeup and big hair and, like a very shiny, sparkly outfit. As a drag king, you would have facial hair applied very frequently, wear a mustache and a beard. You would have, the most masculine kind of moves on stage. So very performative. Gender queer people just reject binary identities. And I would say actually the more common way to talk about that now is non-binary. And that's something you will hear over and over from your youth, who either have a very fluid gender presentation that leans towards femininity sometimes and masculinity at other times, and or blends categories of each, will have feminine and masculine qualities blended within the same outfit, or just really not want to be categorized by gender at all. They may not use a gender pronoun. I have a friend whose gender pronouns, they list them on the screen as they/pterodactyl scream, which I thought was hilarious. Their gender is pterodactyl. And then there are also pre-colonial societies often had more than two genders, which were frequently erased when colonial conquerors came in from Europe. So one of those was two-spirit, which many different Native American or First nations had multiple gender categories, more than just men and women. Generally, two-spirit implies Indigenous or Native American ancestry. So often Native Americans are not thrilled to hear white people applying that idea of two-spirit to themselves. Third gender, or hijra, are still common in India and Pakistan, even though, and to some extent Thailand, even though, again, colonizers tried to wipe that out, they were less successful wiping that out there than they were in terms of wiping out two-spirit here in the Americas. And in Japan, futanari is a third gender category. So some things to know about trans folks. Not all trans people identify as male or female. Trans people have all sorts of different identities outside of the gender binary. Trans folks actually have many different sexual orientations. Gender identity and sexual orientation are separate spectra. Trans folks led the Stonewall riots. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were two among many trans women of color who were on the front lines. And the Stonewall riot, just as a brief aside, Stonewall happened in 1969 when police in New York City attacked the Stonewall Inn, which was a LGBTQ bar, and it's still there actually in Greenwich Village. And after just decades of harassment, the people in the bar were so angry, they fought back, and it turned into a pivotal point in LGBTQ history with people coming out in droves, and it grew into a 3-day riot and really started the kind of nascent LGBTQ movement. Number 4, not all trans people want surgery, and even fewer get surgery. So surgery is incredibly expensive, and transgender folks are frequently discriminated against in employment. And because employment is the way to get health insurance in the United States, their healthcare in general is quite inaccessible. Even if they do have health insurance, it very frequently does not cover gender transition treatments. So it's very difficult to get surgery if you are poor or working class transgender person. And then finally, number 5, the word transgender was popularized by activist Virginia Prince in 1969. She first published the word in December of '69 in an issue of Transvestia. The next letter in the big long acronym is Q for queer. Queer in the past was frequently used as a slur against gay people. And it's still a slur if people yell it out their car window, especially if it's accompanied with projectiles from the car. That's absolutely a slur. However, some people have reclaimed that word, queer, and use it for themselves. Generally, if you don't identify as queer, you might not want to use that word unless someone tells you they identify that way and you should speak of them that way. Outside of that, it tends to be more of an in-group word because of the history of the slur. Some queer folks are nervous about other non-queer people using it. It's often an umbrella term, queer, for sex and gender nonconformists. And basically it means a rejection of normative standards, practices, beliefs, and values. So it's being outside of the norm, sexually, with gender, with other things, mostly those two, sex and gender. It's by far more common among young people. Baby boomers rarely apply that term to themselves because it really just still smacks of that slur feeling. Some people in Gen X use it, but millennials and Generation Z are very comfortable with this term when used non-judgmentally. Q can also mean questioning, meaning this person isn't totally sure what their sexuality or their gender expression might be. And that's really common among young people as a whole. They're still figuring themselves out. They're not totally sure who they are or what they want. So they might identify themselves as questioning. I stands for intersex, and it used to be called hermaphrodite. And that term has fallen out of favor. So intersexed is a blend of female and male characteristics that is both and or neither. Very complicated. It can be chromosomal, meaning there are all sorts of XXY, XYY, X fragile X, X fragile XY, many different chromosomal combinations that we see not only among human beings, but also other mammals, reptiles, fish, lots of beings on Earth. will also have an intersexed expression. It can produce ambiguous genitalia. And the term ambiguous genitalia means when the baby is born and the doctors look at it, they're not sure whether that is a very large clitoris that extends beyond small labia, or if it's a very small penis with testicles or a scrotum that might look like labia, and the testicles are undescended at that point. So generally in the past, in the distant past, intersex people were just left to be themselves because we didn't have surgical procedures yet to correct them. Now, for the past, I would say 50-ish, 50 to 75 years, we've had corrective surgery that often was incredibly problematic for the people that the surgery was performed on. For one thing, they lose sensation, they build up a lot of scar tissue. They often weren't told what was happening, but then they would need all of these surgeries, often in teaching hospitals, where if you're in a teaching hospital and the doctors are doing what they call rounds with their interns, residents is what they're called in medical school. They go around a big group of people and look at the cases of, okay, in this room, it's heart failure. In this other room, it's blindness, whatever. So when they would come to an intersex child, while the rhetoric around the need to give this child surgery is around helping them not feel different, helping them blend in, helping them feel more comfortable, the act of bringing 30 adults into a room to examine a child naked on the bed, looking at their genitals, ended up being really damaging for a lot of these children who have then spoken out. And the American Pediatric Association has responded to a lot of this criticism with changes in their policies. The most recent policies say, if the atypical genitalia has a problem with the urethra, then surgery is necessary, because if you can't pee, you die pretty quickly. But if it's only cosmetic surgery to help the adults feel more comfortable with this child's body, it should not be done until that child can weigh in on whether or not they want surgery. Doing cosmetic surgery on an infant turns out to be a violation of their human rights. A stands for several different things. It might mean aromantic, meaning people that don't identify with that feeling of falling in love. They often have close friendships. They often do develop emotional intimacy with people, but they don't necessarily identify with this love feeling, like a especially sexually romantic feeling of love. Just doesn't make sense to them necessarily. Sometimes aromantic people are also asexual, and sometimes not. Those two don't always go together, but they might. Asexuality used to be categorized as a pathology, that if you didn't want to have sex, there was something wrong with you. Ironically, at the same time, if you wanted to have too much sex, there was something wrong with you. So there was this narrow little range of the amount of sex you should want. Well, asexual people often are not interested in having sex with other people. And some younger people especially will term asexuality as ace. And it is the absence of, or perhaps freedom from, sexual desire. It's a positive identity, meaning they're fine with it. It is not evidence of pathology. It's okay. And it's different from celibacy. Celibacy is the desire to have sex, but you're choosing not to. Asexuality, you're not choosing not to have sex because you're deciding, oh, I want to be a spiritual person or something, and that kind of interferes with my spirituality. You just don't have the desire for sexuality. So it's not based in suppression or repression. It's fine. They're not broken. There's a few different kinds of asexuality, and two that your folks might tell you about, your CASA folks, your children in foster care might identify as demisexuals, meaning they generally don't experience sexual attraction unless or until they have a strong emotional attachment to that person, and then their sexuality may develop with that person. Gray sexuals are people who may have desire for physical closeness. Maybe they want to snuggle. They might even enjoy kissing, perhaps even petting, but generally don't want to have intercourse. However, an A might stand for either aromantic, asexual, or ally, who is a supporter of sexual freedom and diversity. So you all might eventually come to see yourselves as allies if you are in alliance with people who want to just consensually express their sexuality and gender regardless of whether other people are comfortable with it or not. O, not a ton of people using the O. They might be omnisexuals who experience desire on a base other than gender, which could also describe bisexuality, pansexuality, or homosexuality. All of these words have kind of distilled down to pansexual as being the most common among young people. Sometimes O refers to object sexuals, and that may or may not be uncommon among youth. It's a fairly recently recognized sexual identity. It is an erotic and emotional connection with an object rather than a sentient being. And it differs from the Freudian concept of fetishism. Freud talked about a fetish as feeling a sexual desire around an object, often feet or shoes or things like that. Shoes are very common. But in Freudian fetish, people with a shoe fetish don't feel like that shoe loves them back. They are turned on by the thought of shoes. It can kind of add spice to sexuality, but the shoe remains inert. For object sexuals, it's a multi-dimensional relational item with two-way communication and mutual affection. So object sexuals tend to be most attracted to a few different kinds of things. One, a musical instrument, guitar, flute, something that they feel like they have a strong emotional connection with. And when they play their guitar, they feel like that guitar is joyfully participating with them. Sometimes a mode of transportation, a car or a bicycle or a scooter. Sometimes a natural feature in the land, a mountain range, a river, a specific tree. And then sometimes an artificial feature like a bridge or a building or a city. P stands for a couple different things. Pansexual is the most common and something that your kids in foster care might really strongly identify with. They don't desire they not only desire other characteristics besides gender, they may also desire non-material or non-human elements. So pansexuality has room also for object sexuality, omnisexuality. It's kind of a catch-all for not attracted to people based on their gender. Polyamorous, which some of your children might talk about, it's very common among younger folks. It's a form of consensual non-monogamy in which people establish emotionally intimate long-term relationships based around gender equality. So not so much like polygamy, which is about marriage, often in the form of polygyny, which is one husband with multiple wives, but those wives, in theory at least, don't have other partners themselves. Under polyamory, other partners, access to other partners is not dependent on gender. And then homosexuals is the combination of postmodern or postmodernity with sexuality. So those folks, the homosexuals, tend to refuse to categorize sexuality, much like gender non-binary people who don't categorize themselves by gender, male or female on that spectrum. Homosexuals similarly prefer to maintain this fluidity and not be slotted into a specific sexuality box. All of these are affected by what we in sociology call intersectionality. And that's where someone's specific categories impact the way they interact with the world. And we all have intersectional identities. Two of the most important when it comes to sexuality are race and age. So, for instance, a stud is an African-American butch lesbian who comes across as quite masculine. Same gender loving tend to be queer African-Americans. Tortillerismo are Latina lesbians. Also, age is turning out to be incredibly impactful when we talk about sexuality. I keep bringing up this idea that Generation Z and the millennials tend to have a quite more fluid and a different view of sexuality than do especially baby boomers and to some extent Gen X. So young folks tend to insist on fluidity. They don't like these small boxes that the baby boomers and the Gen Xers came up with and ascribed to, which for some baby boomers especially is incredibly painful, because back to Stonewall, the elder LGBTQ folks fought hard for recognition of those categories. Like, those categories made social space for them. They're very important. So to let go of those categories, which works great for the youth, the elders feel ignored and overlooked, and like their contributions to creating a safe space where these youth can express gender and sex diversity have been erased. And that's a generational frisson that's really difficult in the LGBTQ scene still. So gender and sex minority youth, sometimes called GSM, gender and sex minority, tend to have a much wider range of gender and sexual expression among the millennials and especially Generation Z, or the Zoomers, as we call them. And it can clash significantly with baby boomer and Generation X parents who may see gender as fixed by genitalia and sexuality as an outflow of gender. And the younger people don't see it that way, and the older people can't understand why not. Sometimes they can, but frequently it's difficult. And this means that the stigma and bias against LGBTQ youth is really high, especially if they have older parents. And that turns into very high rates of LGBTQ youth in foster care who are homeless, who are experiencing abuse, who are shuffled between multiple living situations. So gender and sexual minority youth are far overrepresented in foster care and in the juvenile justice system than they are in terms of their representation in the population at large. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in terms of homelessness, LGBTQ youth experience many hardships, but about 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. And 42% of homeless agencies don't address LGBTQ issues. The average age that a lesbian and gay youth in New York becomes homeless, under 15, 14.4. The average age that a transgender youth becomes homeless, 13 years old. 68% of homeless youth have experienced family rejection, and 54% have experienced family abuse. Nearly 1 in 3 transgender people have been turned away from homeless shelters. So again, this is from the Trans Student Educational Resources. They've got great stuff there. If you're interested in finding out more about this, check them out. These numbers are even more significant for LGBTQ youth of color. So if they are Black, Indigenous, or other folks of color, it's even more pernicious. The stigma is compounded by racism. So 48% of LGBTQ students of color experienced verbal harassment because of both their sexual orientation and their race or ethnicity. That combination tends to be incredibly potent. 15% have been physically harassed or assaulted based on both of these aspects of their identity. It is 13% more likely for Black LGBTQ youth to be sent to detention or suspended than non-Black LGBTQ youth. And that actually is across the board. Black children are far more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white counterparts for exactly the same behaviors. In their middle school or high school years, almost 80% of LGBTQ youth of color said that they had interactions with security or law enforcement, compared to 63% of white LGBTQ youth. And again, that's similar to rates regardless of sexuality. Youth of color are much more heartily policed than white youth. 20 to 40% of all homeless youth are LGBTQ, and 44, almost half of them, are Black. Over a quarter are Latino. So what does this mean? All of this information I just gave you, what does it mean for CASAs? One thing is that all of this kind of stigma and judgment in society, we've all been socialized with that. Especially if you are not LGBTQ yourself, you probably have not had a lot of exposure to positive messages about gay people, and or unless you have an LGBTQ family member. And these greater social risks, this greater social vulnerability magnifies the risks for youth, and especially if they are BIPOC and poor, and that all of those things combine to make them more likely to be in foster care. Even if they weren't LGBT, the fact that they were a person of color coming from very low economic, socioeconomic status strongly increases their risk of foster care. Add in LGBT to that, and it's just hugely magnified. And I was mentioning LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in foster care. And among not only these people's families of origin, but the foster parents, gender and sexual variation are increasingly common, but little understood. Stigma against families makes it difficult for them to stay together. So let's say the parents are LGBTQ. They will be under increased scrutiny from social service agencies. If they come under the jurisdiction of Children and Family Services and they're LGBT, they are far more likely to lose their children. The kids are more likely to interact with the foster care system, the juvenile court, and other authorities. Again, that intersection of being a sex and gender minority and being poor and being a person of color is especially potent here. And these folks have much higher risk of suicide. And I'm gonna, I'll do it at the end. I have some handouts for you about that. So there are some best practices for how to deal with all of these issues. Currently, 21 states have policies barring, I've just got to move my, there we go, barring discrimination against foster youth based on sexual orientation. And 14 states include gender expression like transgender youth. California, Illinois, and New Mexico require all foster parents to take training on working with LGBTQ youth. And Washington, D.C. requires caseworkers to train in LGBTQ cultural competency. Washington, D.C. has 30 foster homes specifically willing to accept LGBTQ youth. Additional best practices, Maryland screens to ensure LGBT teens are not placed with foster parents who are adamantly opposed to gay relationships. That's important. The Maryland Department of Human Services has new guidelines. They prohibit conversion therapy. So conversion therapy is usually a religiously based therapeutic session that tries to convert someone from being gay or lesbian and or transgender to being a heterosexual cisgender person. And organizations around the World Health Organization, UNICEF, even the UN, have rejected conversion therapy as not only ineffective, but actively very harmful. So conversion therapy is not a good thing at all for these youth. Maryland urges foster parents to call youth by their preferred pronouns, which is a huge issue. If someone's genitalia don't match their gender expression and other people refuse to call them by the pronouns they use to identify themselves, that is corrosive for self-esteem and well-being. And Maryland says that foster parents should let the youth determine their dress and grooming and not force them to wear some other kind of clothes that don't fit their gender expression. There are resources in Colorado for LGBTQ youth. And this is, I was going to say, the tip of the iceberg. This isn't an exhaustive list. These are some. And unfortunately, these resources tend to be concentrated in larger population centers. So there are scant resources for these youth outside of the larger cities. And that's true not only in Colorado, but across the states as well. There's some in Boulder County has resources in Boulder County, Inside Out Youth Services in Colorado Springs. The center in Denver is an LGBTQ center on Colfax Avenue, and they have Rainbow Alley for youth, queer youth. In Northern Colorado, there's Splash. Co4Kids has LGBTQ resources for parents and professionals. And then there's a statewide resource at the bottom. Sorry, my phone. Sorry about that. And I'm very interested if you all have additional resources to share with each other. And I have a few PDFs I'm going to stick in the chat. And my final slide, ways to make schools safer for LGBTQ students, because problems at school will often dovetail with either becoming involved with the juvenile justice system, running away, being kicked out of their homes. The problems at school for these youth will often begin and or exacerbate other issues that are directly linked to ending up in foster care. So one way is to speak out, be an activist, speak out when someone says something discriminatory about LGBTQ folks. For students, start a GSA, which is Gay Straight Alliance, or QSA, Queer Straight Alliance, so the LGBTQ students don't feel so alone. Educating teachers who can simply know about being LGBTQ can make a huge difference for students who are gender and sex minorities. Host an LGBTQ panel. Introduce trans inclusive policies, especially around restrooms and playing on sports teams and using preferred pronouns. That's very important. So I'm going to stop my share and start dropping things in the chat. And I'm hoping, bullying at school also leads to absenteeism. Thank you, Bruce Lane. That is absolutely the case. Absolutely. Christine Larson says, support them, but set boundaries. Could you tell me a little bit, Christine, while I'm adding in these things to the chat, what do you mean by set boundaries? Boundaries around what? Okay, Christine might not be available right now. I wonder if you all have any questions about what I've presented so far.
Dr. Eli, there is a question around the term gender dysphoria, if you can speak to that.
Absolutely. So gender dysphoria is a diagnosis, actually. It's in this book they call the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And that's what psychiatrists and other mental health professionals use to diagnose mental illness. So gender dysphoria is the diagnosis of feeling like the physical body does not match the internal sense of gender. And some transgender people really don't like that term because it implies malfunctioning. But it's also the gateway to treatment. Without a diagnosis, it's difficult to get treatment, and it's really difficult to get gender transition hormones or surgery, anything like that. So many are kind of forced into accepting this diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So dysphoria means this doesn't match, this doesn't feel comfortable. These two things don't go together. So they'll have some kind of bodily characteristics that don't match their internal gender expression. And for youth who have no desire to, let's say, change their gender on their birth certificate or their driver's license, or legally change their names, or legally change their gender, they won't need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. But for anyone who wants the kind of intervention that comes with a legal name change, a legal gender change, you need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So it's a gateway that gatekeepers patrol heavily, and there's issues around it, but it's useful as a diagnosis in terms of attempting to get treatment. And I'm happy to give copies of the slides as well. I'll give the whole presentation over, and I have those PDFs, and I was able to drop them in the chat once, and now I'm having a hard time doing that again. Are there additional questions? You know what I think I might want to do is just provide the entire presentation and the PDFs of resources to the central CASA folks, and maybe they can send them out to everyone. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
We'll plan a follow-up email for those that couldn't make it, with all of the resources that you're willing to share. There is another a question in the chat.
Yes.
What steps can I, as an older cis boomer, take to recognize my unconscious bias towards LGBTQ youth?
That's such a good question. I'm so glad you asked that. Harvard has an unconscious bias test that on all sorts of different things. They started with race, and that's really interesting. But also, they've got some on LGBTQ folks. So you can take that test. It doesn't fix anything, but it kind of points out unconscious bias. And I can, if somebody wants to, who knows what I'm talking about, wants to drop that link in the chat, that'd be great. And if not, I will find that and include that in the materials that I provide. Another thing is, oh, there it is. Thank you so much, Jessica Lesko. That's exactly it. Unconscious bias. So a way to combat any kind of unconscious bias is education is fantastic. So listen to podcasts about LGBTQ youth, especially. Read books, watch movies. Talk to the youth about how do they identify, what do they think of the world, listen to them and try to get as much information from outside of a heterosexual cisgender bubble as possible is a great way to combat bias. And that's true of bias around white privilege and / racism. That's also true about any other kind of bias. So checking out those unconscious bias tests on the Harvard website is a great place to start. They also have other resources there on that website. Christine Larson, I see your hand is up. Hi, Christine.
Yeah, I kind of, you asked about setting boundaries. I was trying to type it. I didn't realize you were saying to come on here. Wasn't really paying too close attention. What I meant by set boundaries is I grew up where it didn't matter what you were. Everybody was loved. We all, accepted everyone for who they are.
Lucky you.
As a CASA converting into a foster care family, because we're trying to do that, we have decided to set boundaries. Now, boundaries is not a bad thing. It's just saying, hey, what you are is fine, but in our home, you cannot go this far with your sexuality. Like, you can't make out in the living room with your spouse, whatever. These are boundaries. We're allowing them to be who they are, but we're teaching them that there's a set limit. Like, I am a woman and a man relationship only, but you will not see us doing anything more than maybe holding hands or kissing, whatever is in the bedroom. It is private and it stays private. And that's what we kind of need to teach them, because I think a lot of the stigma that's being created is because a lot of kids are not taught boundaries and they're not taught, limits. So they just go out and in public, they just do whatever. And so it creates stigma because people get, not, I don't really want to use the word disgusted, but I've encountered times when I worked at a gas station that two gay guys and, came out of their limo and I was watching and they were doing up their pants. I mean, just being totally inappropriate as adults. And so it's like, they must have, I didn't look bad at them. I just said to myself, they must not have been taught boundaries.
I would say that goes for anyone of any sex or gender orientation. It's not specific to LGBTQ youth, but I think it stands out more. People notice it more.
Yeah.
LGBTQ youth. For instance, there's this kind of cultural idea of, okay, go ahead and be gay, but just keep it to yourself. Well, we don't say that to heterosexuals. If heterosexuals are walking down the street holding hands, we're not
Exactly.
so disgusting. Keep that heterosexuality to yourself. Or if
Exactly.
People have, for instance, at work, if they have a picture of themselves and their other sex spouse, that's not stuffing heterosexuality down people's throats. But if people have a picture of themselves and their same-sex spouse, suddenly they're accused of stuffing that down other people's throats or inflicting it on other people. So I agree, don't inflict your sexuality on other people regardless of your sexual orientation.
Exactly.
Boundaries should be the same for LGBTQ youth as they are for heterosexual youth.
Exactly. And that's what me and my husband feel, that it doesn't matter what you are, there should be boundaries or limits set to teach appropriateness. And that's
Absolutely.
what I meant by boundaries.
I would agree.
Like I said, I mean, my best friend of 32 years, she is lesbian. She told me on my 16th birthday. My response wasn't, ooh, gross. It was, that's great. But I want you to know that I am straight. And as long as you don't hit on me or try to convert my beliefs, we're great. And I believe that goes to being open-minded. And I don't think there's enough people in society that are that way. And they should, and I feel they should be educated that way. But that's just my experiences, growing up and how I feel things should be done.
I apologize. I'm going to hop in because we are right a little over the 1:15 time. But if people, Dr. Eli, thank you so much for your presentation. If you have time to linger and people still have questions, please let us know. But I also want to
definitely can.
Oh, wonderful. And I put a link in the chat and I'll put it in the email with the resources that you're going to share out. We'd love feedback about the webinar and for suggestions for the future. So thank you everyone for coming today. And thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Dr. Eli, we'll hang around for a bit if people want to keep asking any questions. But for those that can't hang on, we'll see you in the future.
So those of you who are still here, do you have further questions?
Dr. Eli?
Yes.
I have a question. It seems like, of course, the ages that you were showing on those flyers were quite young for the kids that go homeless in New York. I'm wondering how young or what is the general age that kids start to kind of really identify?
That's a really good question. Puberty is a crux time for everyone developing a sex and gender identity. And any other kind of identity. Puberty is kind of where the rubber hits the road. However, some children know as early as 3 what gender they feel like on the inside and may want to express that. There's a lot of kind of discord and tumult among pediatric, especially endocrinologists who deal with kind of puberty and things, about whether prepubescent children should get either hormones of the other gender, of a different gender, or puberty blockers. And some people say, yes, absolutely. Don't make that poor kid go through, who knows they're a girl on the inside. Don't make them go through puberty, and, you know, because then they've got to develop, they're 6'4" with an Adam's apple in a very deep voice, and undoing that is incredibly difficult. So don't inflict that on them if they know they're a girl. Other pediatricians say kids change their mind, they're not sure what's happening with them. We shouldn't do these permanent changes until they're older. So I would say there's as yet no singular and solid agreement about that. I know 8 years old is often a threshold that no one will do anything to children below 8 years old, but sometimes at between 8 and 15, children want puberty blockers. They want other hormones, and some parents are fine with that, and some parents are really against that. And it has certainly been a factor in more than one custody case, with one parent saying, let the kid be who they are, and another parent saying, don't give a young child hormones when, what if they change their mind in 15 years and we've altered their body permanently?
Are there any, I know that as CASAs and volunteers, we may be faced with younger children bringing this up while we are in their presence or while we're around them. Are there any really good young books for children that perhaps would guide us to what would be an appropriate conversation to have with these kids if they do bring it up?
I do have some resources on that I will provide Kelsey.
Okay.
In the links I'm going to provide, there are some discussion about kids, but for the young kids, there just isn't that much. People are really nervous about interfering and or facilitating at that very young age. And even if they decide, okay, let's do this, they might get some significant pushback from medical professionals. So the fact that the kind of medical and psychiatric community is in such tumult over that makes it difficult. But there are resources that kind of encapsulate these ideas with more detail than I've provided. So I will.
Sure. I just want to be prepared if it does come up, making sure that I have an appropriate conversation that doesn't overstep the boundaries of the parent, but also showing the child that I'm supportive to them in an age appropriate manner.
Agreed. And I wish there were more resources for that.
Yeah.
There are a few, but it's not enough, I would say.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Mary, I see your hand is up.
You're still muted, Mary.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. I so enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
How is there any way to, I'm basing this on personal experience. My daughter is gay, lesbian. From the time she was 2 or 3 years old. She was not interested in Barbie dolls. She wanted to play with G.I. Joes and trucks. And, then she struggled with her gender identity. Went in the army, then got married, had children, and then got divorced, and then finally came out. But as a parent or as a CASA, dealing with young children. If you've got a, let me stop that.
I feel for Mary, my phone went off too.
Yeah, if you're with a child and the child kind of seems to, is there any specific guidance, or do you just kind of go with the flow and see what happens?
I would say be askable. So make it really clear to the child that they can ask questions, they're safe to ask you questions about anything. They can tell you things, even if they weren't comfortable telling them to other people. You could, I had my little gay flag sweatshirt on, but it just got too hot in this room. Flag being an ally with little rainbow things.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Great idea. Yeah.
And perhaps drop in conversation. You know, my daughter's gay and I love her, and she's maybe had a difficult time of it at first, and she's really found her way to drop a little trail of breadcrumbs that leads to you as a safe person, indicating allyship.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Kelly, I see you've got your hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I have a question. Maybe the internet and social media and the different thing that I was not exposed to when I was a teen, and now there's so much junk out there, and so many things that a youth is exposed to when they're just trying to find themselves anyway. And do you have any advice on that? Because, for example, like what Christine was saying earlier about setting boundaries and everything, but then there are so many different things out there, especially in that community, that may be confusing to them. Like, for example, there's a lot of, the gay rights parade down in Denver. We were down there a few years back for that, and but there's so many people that are walking around, in their underwear, let's say, and I mean, just so, I don't care if you're straight or gay or lesbian, I don't care what you are, that's not appropriate to do in our society. We're not supposed to just be, walking around doing that. So it can give them such mixed messages on how they're feeling about themselves, and thinking, well, this is wrong because I'm seeing all these people acting all weird. You know what I'm saying? I mean, maybe I'm not making myself clear, but I want to be able to be helpful to a youth that I might come in encounter with, and not make and have them not feel bad about themselves just because some other people are acting inappropriate. Anyway, do you have any advice?
Absolutely. Generally, I think those youth probably wouldn't feel bad about themselves until adults point out, oh, that's shameful. Oh, that's problematic. Oh, that's bad. And gay pride is a very adult thing. Many gay prides will have family sections, but I wouldn't say pride is the place to start with youth. I would start with more youth-oriented things, because Pride is pretty adult. It's for the adults. It's a huge party. It started as a adult move for recognition and legal protections and has transitioned into a big party. But regardless of sexual orientation, that degree of open sexuality and party orientation is better focused on adults. I would angle for youth specific resources. For instance, at the center on Colfax, they have that, I think it's Rainbow Alley for the youth. I would start there and not at Pride. Generally, I think youth, unless adults have been telling them sex negative messages, gay, homophobic messages, they're not going to look at adults and think, oh, that adult is bad, that must mean I'm bad. They're going to look more at adults and think, that's wacky. You know, any more so than heterosexual youth look at people in pornography and think, oh, that means me. You know, gay youth are, outside of being gay, treat them like heterosexual youth. If you wouldn't assume a heterosexual youth is patterning themselves after somewhat highly sexualized media star or something, gay youth might not be as well. But don't, because so much of the queer world is focused on adults, much like heterosexuality is focused on adults. You know, we're not telling 8-year-old people who are presumably heterosexual about how to manage their sexuality. We're kind of buffering them from sexuality. It's too soon to engage with sexuality at 8 years old. Did that answer your question?
Right.
Okay. I also
well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's just, you know, logical thinking on just saying, look, no matter what the child's preference is or anything like that, it doesn't matter, because there's inappropriate behavior and there's appropriate behavior, and
exactly.
And you just teach them
that's such a good point.
that way.
I would absolutely
right.
agree with you, Kelly. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Walking around in your underwear, unless you're at a beach or the nude beach, or you know, wherever heterosexuals wear extremely revealing clothing, which is a lot of places. Like, I'm hearing we don't need to distinguish between and treat gay youth and have a whole separate set of standards for gay youth.
Right.
As
Right.
heterosexual youth. If
right.
House, it's not okay for 14-year-olds to have sex, then it's not okay regardless of the gender of the partner they're having sex with. It's more that they're 14, regardless of the content of that sexual experience. I also wanted to point out that Jessica Lesko had such a good point. She says, I wear a pronoun pin all the time. The kiddos asked me about it and we had a chance to chat. So if you are flagging she, her, or ask someone, I use she, her pronouns. What pronouns do you prefer? If they are cisgender, they may have never thought about it before, and it could help them to think about it. And if they are gender nonconforming or transgender, then having that space created is fantastic. Jessica, thank you for that truly excellent suggestion. Does anyone else have a question?
kind of let the silence sit there. Sometimes it's hard because sometimes people take a moment, but want to thank you again so much, and we'll coordinate over email to get the resources, and I'll share that out with everyone, even the ones that couldn't make it today.
Fantastic.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Go forth and be kind.